Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for the Better Food Future virtual summit to launch Pathway to Traceable Beef and Leather and the launch of Better Food Future in support of the UN Global Compact's Ocean Stewardship Coalition's work to establish global data standards for sustainable supply chains. We established Better Food Future as a vehicle to make this happen by establishing an operational model for a platform for collaborative action that would bring together private sector and donor and organized development aid funding to de-risk investments into sustainable supply chains and help advance global data standards at an industry-wide level, as represented here by bringing together all aspects of the cattle industry from beef, leather, automotive, and other users of cattle-related products. We started out basing this initiative on the Global Dialogue for Seafood Traceability. And today what we're going to do is cover a little bit of how data standards have worked in practice, as I mentioned, seafood, food safety, et cetera, how this is being replicated into beef and leather, as well as grains for feed, like soy, and the roadmap for other fully traceable, sustainable supply chains that we can potentially explore collaboration on in the future. The role for Better Food Future is to enable not just as a platform for collaborative action, but as a platform for co-investment. Food Tank is our fiscal sponsor, which will allow both for donations and private sector contributions. Again, to help de-risk the investments into sustainable supply chains and help facilitate acceleration of impact towards shared goals. And today what we're going to do is lay out the experience, our model, and some future plans that will help BFF help everyone involved achieve their goals using global data standards to help, again, accelerate that impact. What we'd ask is for this to be an interactive conversation, even though we're here in a virtual webinar. If you could please enter comments into the chat, we'll take those into account and then open up the floor for questions throughout the webinar. And also, please help us indicate what work streams you'd be interested in participating in. We're going to be looking at development of the standard, the governance of a collaboration platform, specific pilots that'll be deployed in the supply chains, technology reviews, industry and industry advocacy, and then evaluating the reporting of the data that we collect through those supply chains. So with that, I'm going to turn it over and welcome Fernando from WWF. Fernando is the Senior Director of Beef and Leather Supply Chains. So thank you, Fernando.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks everyone for being here today. I don't know if it's good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending where you are. I promise I'm going to be very brief today. I just want to share some history of this discussion, some background information. But before I do that, I just want to thank a few people, organizations that helped us to prepare this event today. So I want to send a special thank to IFT. We have Blake and Sarah here today, Hold Chain, of course, Mark, Jason, Erin, Hever Consulting. We have John, Natalia here today, FA Farms, represented by Austin. And of course, I cannot forget Katri and Mackenzie, our colleagues from WWF. They all put a lot of work to come up with this concept we want to share with you. I can also not forget to thank Tapestry Foundation to help to make this work viable. And today we have Earl Shank and David Wright here from Tapestry Inc. Representing the foundation. We've been working for about 20 years looking at to the production of different commodities and the connection they have to different environmental impacts, including deforestation and conversion of ecosystems. But more importantly, we have also working with private sectors connected in those supply chains to try to find new approaches, to find new, to create new tools that will help us to drive towards more sustainable supply chains and more transparent supply chains. About 5 years ago, we understood that leather should also be part of that discussion. Leather is one of the byproducts of beef production. It also comes from cattle, and they also they care they carry part of the responsibility for some of those impacts, but also they are an important voice in that dialogue. So we believe that by working with leather, we can, as sectors together, we can move faster and towards our goals of having more sustainable supply chains. We are not there yet. There is still a lot of work to be done, but we throughout this journey, we've been able to connect with a lot of good initiatives, to see a lot of good solutions. We are seeing new approaches being developed every month related to traceability, monitoring of supply chains, new approach in how to deal with how to engage suppliers, so that there are good things happening out there. But we also see that very often when you're in a globalized market, when you have different companies, different organizations trying to develop new approaches, even when those approaches they are well intended and they are delivering positive results, but if they are not aligned, they can also create confusion and they can be detrimental to the ultimate goals that we have to create deforestation-free supply chains. So we started this collaborating with different organizations to understand how we could support better sector alignments. In the end of last year, we started a discussion. We had a meeting between WWF, IFT, Hold Chain, Rever Consulting, GS1, and FA Farms, supported by Tapestry Foundation, where we started the discussion about creating a global traceability data framework for beef and leather. And this is what we want to present to you today. Today is not the end of this work. Today is really the start, and we want to share an initial concept and how we believe we should engage stakeholders in those supply chains, hoping to continue this work. We believe that if we can set up a traceability framework, we would be able to align industry efforts, set clear requirements, data requirements, but also support compliance with regulations like EUDR, but also compliance to voluntary commitments. An aligned food traceability framework will unlock value for producers, suppliers, brands, while ensuring we are going in the right direction. So we believe this is a very important project. So with that in mind, I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to invite Earl Schenk from Tapestry to share his perspective, his vision about this journey. So thank you all once again, and please, Earl, it's with you now.
Great. Thanks so much, Fernando. And again, just want to really reiterate the thanks to the partners who have worked on this already to contribute their thought leadership, their experience working in this space. I think also really excited to see this work continue to develop and get elevated within this space. To Fernando's point, this feels in some ways like a long time coming. We've known the challenge, but it feels like we're starting to zero in on solutions. And that doesn't mean that the work is done. It means the work is really ready to get rolling and get started in earnest. So today I'm going to be representing a brand perspective, particularly the Tapestry Inc. Brand perspective. I want to walk through a little bit of our relevant traceability journey. I want to talk about some of the challenges in the leather space, solutions, and specifically why we think a traceability data framework has an opportunity here that can be really impactful in this space. And then I want to talk about the path forward, how we see this evolving. And I think that will make for a nice segue in the handoff to the next speaker. So as I get ready to do that, I want to make sure that I introduce myself and introduce Tapestry as well, to ensure that folks know who I am and the brands that I'm speaking about the experience of. So my name is Earl Schenk, Senior Manager of Traceability at Tapestry, focused on all things: where do our fibers, materials, and products come from? What are the impacts of those origins, those production processes where those fibers, materials, and products come from? And I think then the most important, what can we do about it? What can we use about that information that we understand about where fibers, materials, and products come from and their impact in order to make more responsible sourcing decisions? So that's me. Tapestry is a house of brands consisting of Coach and Kate Spade, really focused on leather, to be honest. We take leather really seriously, both in terms of how and why we use it. And we also take leather really seriously in the way that we think of our work around leather as stewards of the industry. We have this adage at Coach, at least, that Coach is the original American house of leather. And so as we've used that material, the Coach brand, for over 80 years now, and we think about how we can continue to use that material into the future, we've got to be really strategic and thoughtful about how we ensure that practices that are part of leather supply chains are as responsible as possible. And I think this is a big part of that. So want to jump into a bit about our traceability journey. I'm going to start, I guess, a bit wider and then zero in from there. So over the last several years, we've made pretty significant progress in mapping our supply chains. Leather makes up over 50% of our material by material weight across our brand portfolio. And so as part of that supply chain mapping, we focused really significant energy and effort on mapping specifically leather supply chains. The good news is that fairly consistently, we've been able to get back to at least the abattoir, so the meat packer, the slaughterhouse level of the supply chain. Early on, though, it became apparent that the complexity and opacity of cattle raising would hamper us from getting to the farm level data using the mapping approach alone. And in different settings, I've talked a bit about our experience here, but as we got further and further upstream beyond the point of the abattoir, we realized, and we knew this, but when you start collecting the actual data and see the numbers, it adds up really quickly, and you're able to go from the anecdotal idea that there's a lot of farms to the recognition that there are so many farms that it starts to quickly become unmanageable using mapping alone. So we're seeing this in the supply chain. We're asking why is this happening? And we've come down to these three unique-ish factors that exist in the leather supply chain that present these challenges that we ultimately have to overcome if we want to be able to achieve traceability in leather supply chains. And this is true of beef as well. I say leather here, but for anyone joining with more of a beef-centric perspective on the cattle side, I believe these are relevant, at least some of these are relevant to you as well. So on the leather side, hides are a byproduct. We're very clear about that. We understand that cattle are not being raised for hides. What this means is that ranchers are not raising cattle for the purpose of leather. And by extension, the amount of leverage that exists for a leather-focused organization is very limited compared to other materials that are common in the sewn goods space, right? If we're talking about a material like cotton that is the cash crop, you plant the cotton, you harvest the cotton, and that's why you're doing this work. That's the first challenge. The second is that cattle move around, and they move around quite a bit. So similarly, contrasting this against other supply chains where you can plant your crop or tend to your crop and come back and harvest cattle or animals. And so this is a challenge that exists in other animal fiber-centric supply chains. But these cattle move around a lot, and so it means you're accumulating numerous farms for every one of those head of cattle. And again, it adds up quickly. And then the third, and one that's maybe discussed a little bit less, but that we've seen as a critical challenge in this space, is the grading of leather. Unlike most other materials that are being handled in the sewn good industry, you don't have consistent quality across a batch of hides, nor can you grade those hides in the same way with hair on as you can later on after processing. And so the result is you're mixing and batching through the supply chain in a distinctive way, whereby a single batch or lot of cattle is needing to have those hides mixed and recombined into different lots along the way. And we just don't see this in a lot of other sewn goods supply chain. So I bring this up, but none of this is to say anything about national or regional practices that also vary widely. And so as folks probably on the line have experienced in similar type conversations, it's very easy to get into the nuance of practices in South America versus North America versus Eurasia, and how those add additional complexity in the form of different ways of doing business and doing work that require some amount of accommodation. So that's our quick sort of traceability journey. Challenges in the market. As Fernando mentioned, we're seeing a lot of traceability or initiatives with traceability in their title going on in the market right now, particularly to cattle and the leather space. And on one hand, we think that's really exciting. It means that we've got the focus from the industry on working toward recognizing that traceability is a key enabler to get to where we want to get, but it's not the solution in and of itself. We've seen that as we've worked with suppliers, we're spanning a variety of countries, and so as those different traceability initiatives are getting kicked off and are taking hold, we're having to deal with the different language those different initiatives are presenting, the different definitions, varying maturity and understanding of what's meant by traceability. And then, of course, across regional locations, we're dealing with different types of regulatory exposure, where some locations may need to comply in one way, requiring certain approaches, while others may not have those same requirements. In short, there's little consensus on the core information needed in each step of the supply chain, and this is creating some significant challenges. We have some familiarity in the industry, which we think is exciting, using mechanisms like chain of custody and certification, but we also have some concerns about how far those types of ideas can take us, particularly as they relate to the European anti-deforestation regulation and what exactly it demands. And then we've seen, even in some cases, this is again in my challenges and market section, where data is actually available. It's being captured, but the way that it's being organized is highly inconsistent, and the inconsistencies of that data capture lead to a host of challenges in being able to actually leverage and utilize that data. And so we're doing the right things industry-wide in one hand, we're collecting the data, but we're just not structuring it. And so that takes us to this concept of interoperable frameworks and what we think is really necessary here. And this is why we have pivoted and why we're so supportive and excited about this work, and where we think this builds greatly on the supply chain mapping that we've been able to do, and I know a lot of our peers have been able to do as well. And so what we were able to start to figure out is, by defining key events that make up traceability events in the supply chain and defining the data that's necessary in order to capture each of those key events, we could take a more structured approach to identifying not only what suppliers and what transformation processes are happening in the supply chain and how those connect, but also where there are gaps in the data, right? I imagine folks on the line have at times maybe tried to request some of this data and receive PDFs that have a lot of great data in them, but that demand additional attention to understand how that data all connects, and how that may be similar to other stacks of data that you've collected via PDF. And so we've realized as we've gone down this path that it's really critical to not only have the data and have it existing in the world, but to have it existing in the world in a way that it's structured and in a way that it can be usable, and in a way that usability can be scaled over time to fit into data systems and fit into how those data systems talk to other data systems. So, path forward, where we hope things are headed, and I hope this creates a good segue over to Blake, is we see a vision to achieve farm-level event-based traceability that enables us to meet our commitments at Tapestry around deforestation-free leather, supporting EUDR compliance, but it's also, to Fernando's point, applicable to support other desired outcomes around topics like animal welfare, emissions reduction, and support of regenerative agriculture. So I think that's one of the exciting things about this approach too, is it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but it's a one-size-fits-scale approach, where we're not needing this to address deforestation or even EUDR, but we're using this to address a variety of challenges in leather, cattle, beef supply chains that go back to the farm level and that require an understanding back to the farm level of specific practices or ways of doing work upstream in the supply chain. We think that a standardized data framework based on an established GS1 standard allows us to really scale this work quickly and make the data accessible for due diligence. We think that fortunately some of this work has been done in other spaces, and in the leather, beef, cattle space, perhaps we can borrow from that and use that to move more quickly than perhaps some of those other spaces moved when they were initially trying to implement this. And then we think that if we can drive toward a consistent approach shared between cattle supply chains focused on birth forward rather than hamburger or handbag backwards, not only can leather and beef supply chains achieve the traceability we need, but we can also reward real good, better, and best practices at the farm level and in the supply chain. And in that way, I think there's an opportunity really for a virtuous cycle here where good practices that would otherwise be hard to trace and track are getting rewarded, and thus we're promoting those good practices and we're seeing them compound over time. So with that, I'm going to hand things off to Blake, as I mentioned, to discuss how data standards lead to traceability and really getting into the meat of this work and how we practically start to make this happen.
Yeah. So before Blake comes up, I just want to give a quick intro. I'm Jason Berryhill with WholeChain, just like the panelists earlier, I'd like to just say thank you to all the other partners in this initiative. This is a very important body of work that we've been contributing on together. Today, you're going to hear a lot, and you already have heard a lot about standards. Standards, it's a word that's used frequently within supply chain work, but it can mean many different things. A lot of times it's used in the sense of a benchmark or certification, meeting a standard. When we say standards today, we're meaning like the root of the word standardization. In other words, a leveling so that systems can work together. It's kind of like your electrical plug. When you plug something in, that is standardization at work. And if you look at the arc of technological innovation across different industries, across time, you'll see that it generally bends towards standardization. That's how things become easy in our lives. The electrical grid is easy for me, not because I have to wire up my toaster oven every morning to make breakfast, but because I can just plug it in through a standardized plug. That's important because right now there's a lot of initiatives going on and a lot of technological developments within supply chains, specifically within the leather industry, but also other industries to meet consumer demand, to meet regulatory demand. These are things like tagging, mapping, reporting. These are all very important, but what we're dealing with today is a little bit different. What we're dealing with is a framework of standardization so the data itself can be shared seamlessly among systems, just like electricity can be shared between the wall outlet and the toaster oven. It doesn't require one single system across the supply chain, but many can interoperate together. So it's important that a number of things happen, and Blake is going to get into much more of a deep dive, and then I'll come back. But first of all, what you'll see is this is across commodities. The standard that we're talking about is a framework that's been used in multiple commodities in the past and is being used in many commodities in the present and will continue on into the future. That is important because when we talk about the leather industry, we're really not talking about the leather industry alone. Just like Earl said, we're talking about a byproduct, the beef industry. But then we're not just talking about leather and beef, we're also talking about livestock. And it needs to be able to connect to all these things to really be seamless throughout the supply chain. It also needs to go across systems. So different systems being able to talk to each other so that the whole world doesn't have to use one system, which is not likely to happen. It needs to connect to end products. And as Earl mentioned earlier, we're talking about a standard used that's promulgated by GS1. GS1, for those of you not familiar, is the group behind the barcode. So 6 billion barcodes a day that get scanned are all part of the GS1 identification schema. And this standard that we're talking about today, EPCIS, which you'll hear more about, it uses that same identification schema. And finally, and what you'll see is it's tested in the field. We have done years worth of work in using this throughout the cattle supply chain in different parts of the supply chain, in fact, the entire value chain, and being able to showcase how this can be used, yes, for traceability, but also as a beginning framework for some of the other concerns, whether they be social and environmental, as we go forward. So I'll hand it over to Blake, and then I'll come back in a minute and talk more about that testing in the field.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason. Hey, everybody, I'm Blake Harris, the Technical Director at the Institute of Food Technologists, Global Food Traceability Center. We work across stakeholders from regulatory agencies to industry to associations, certifications, nonprofits, really to try to promote best practices in traceability, help develop these standards that Jason's talked about in other commodities, and support that implementation. So today I'm going to go through sort of what is driving this conversation globally, agnostic of commodity. I'm going to talk about these frameworks that we've been mentioning and the components of them, and then I'm going to talk about how that can lead to this digital transformation, the need for interoperability, and then, of course, going to go into a bit more on the seafood initiative that we've mentioned, the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability, and how we could use the resources, tools, and tests that they've developed as sort of a template for this work, propelling this work from cattle forward. And then I'll end with kind of going over the work that we've done since, well, that the GFT season been involved with since December, building off, of course, years of work and research from others. So a lot to cover. Gonna go ahead and get started. So first and foremost, nobody does traceability just to do traceability. There's always an underlying question you're trying to answer about a product, right? Whether that be a sustainability question, greenhouse gas tracking, support for recall investigations from a food safety perspective. There's a number of different use cases, but all of them underpinning need traceability in order to understand where that product's coming from, what the actual impacts are, and being able to measure those impacts and monitor them. So there's a number of different use cases. It's not just deforestation, it's not just food safety, but you can really take this framework that we're developing that is traceability specific and apply it to a number of other use cases. So what's driving this conversation forward globally? I think we've seen a lot of regulations either in discussion or being implemented over the last 5 to 10 years that have traceability specific attributes to them. I've listed a couple here as just examples. You've got in the US, the Food Safety Modernization Act, Section 204. This is an FDA regulation that requires traceability on high-risk foods. So it's from that food safety side of things. In the US, you also have the Seafood Import Monitoring Program, which is a NOAA regulation that's focused on keeping illegal seafood out of US commerce. I think we're probably all fairly familiar with the EU deforestation regulation, which requires traceability, as well as a number of other global efforts going on around the world, including in Australia, Japan, and Canada. ESG commitments and impact investing are also a really big driver of this conversation. I've listed Walmart and Cargill here, although there are thousands of other organizations who have made ESG commitments, and really underlying being able to understand your reduction of 1 billion metric tons of GHGs or deforestation-free ag supply chains, you need to know where your products are coming from, because these companies aren't completely vertically integrated with everything that's going on. And so that is also driving a need for increased traceability. I've also included here impact investing. I think FAIR is a really good example of that. They've got 400 members managing $75 trillion in assets, and they're using that leverage to really drive ESG advancements in ESG commitments and targets with major corporations. You've also got just the general complexity of global supply chains. They continue to expand. Supply chains continue to expand over more and more countries. More and more organizations have their hands on products as they get transformed from raw materials to finished goods. So managing that risk is also critical, but requires traceability. And then advances in technology. Blockchain has now been something that's been used in supply chains for almost 8 years now. You've got AI, machine learning. You've got a lot more open source tools, and these advances in technology are really driving progress. And also these technologies are starting to be around longer and longer, which is driving down cost as well. So I'm going to kind of switch back into education mode and really talk about a common definition for traceability. I would imagine if we took a poll of everybody trying to give me their definition of traceability, it would probably be at least slightly different for each individual. So there's kind of two components when you think about traceability. And often when we go talk to industry about their traceability practices, the response is very much focused on internal traceability. So what is being received, what is being done to that input in the facility, and then what is the eventual output? It could be a consumer good, or it could be a component that goes into a consumer good later. Internal traceability is extremely important and requires a lot of cross-functional communication from receiving, procurement, QA, within the facility. And it's also really important, a really important component of end-to-end traceability. Because at the end of the day, if you're trying to trace a full supply chain and you have essentially a black box contained within that supply chain, it doesn't work. And that is what we're ultimately striving to get to, right? Is end-to-end traceability, which involves tracking the movement of products across the entire supply chain, from point of origin to the point of depletion or when that is sold to the ultimate consumer. And this requires communication and collaboration between all actors in the supply chain. So what is traceability? The common definition is the systematic ability to trace the path of food ingredients and or finished products throughout their entire life cycle by means of previously captured and stored records. So now this brings us to this best practice framework that we've been talking about. This framework consists of two kind of core components. The first component is what we refer to as critical tracking events. These are essentially the activities that are occurring throughout the supply chain, and they represent where data needs to be captured in order to maintain traceability throughout the supply chain. So it could be an activity like growing, harvesting, processing. When you ship a product to your customer, when they receive that product from you, that's also a critical tracking event. Storage. There's a number of different critical tracking events that happen throughout the supply chain. Some happen multiple times, and depending on regional context, it could be that the CTEs that are set up, you don't use all of them. But these are really important, essentially saying, here's the activities that can occur throughout the entire supply chain. Now, combined with key data elements, which are essentially the specific data points that need to be captured at each critical tracking event to successfully trace a product, right? So these are the who, what, when, where, and why of a product as it moves through each of these critical tracking event stages. And this in general is that event-based traceability framework that can be applied whether you are tracking heads of cattle, hamburgers, or handbags. It's a very flexible framework, but it also helps to coordinate amongst all the supply chain actors as they better understand what their data responsibilities are. So kind of switching back to standardization, now that we've gone through the framework, why is it important? We've gone over this from some of the other speakers, but essentially it establishes the guidelines to ensure uniformity, compatibility, and consistency in a particular context, right? So if we have all the critical tracking events mapped out in the supply chain, all of those critical tracking events have a defined set of data elements that need to be required, we now can be sure that everyone is collecting uniformly the data that needs to be collected in order to have consistent traceability throughout the food system. It also does act as a reference point for products and processes, and it is the absolute foundation for creating, understanding, and implementing a set of shared practices, which, because traceability is the shared responsibility throughout the supply chain, is critically important. So using a traceability framework, essentially it defines what data should be collected through the defined key data elements, when that data should be collected through defining the critical tracking events, and then building on that, how that data should be formatted and how that data should be shared. And that goes more to the digitization and interoperability side. So essentially the framework will dictate, again, what data gets collected and when through the CTEs and KDEs, which provides instructions, consistent implementation, reduces duplicative efforts, and supports veracity and validity of that data. It dictates how it gets formatted. Again, this is important to understand when you think about it from a common data format, and we use the example of dates, right? So why is this important? We have a lot of different ways to express the same piece of information. Today was March 13th. You could say March 13th or 3/13 or 13/3, depending on where you live. And so by requiring a common data format, it allows for one software system to be able to ingest that data much more easily because it understands that data that's coming to it. And then it also dictates how that data gets shared. So when you're talking about sharing data from software to software, you're talking about APIs or communications protocols. And a standard also includes the common protocol for data exchange so that everybody following that standard is using the same method and can therefore communicate it with their supply chain partners, reduces complexity, cost, and improves data quality. So now I'm going to talk about digitization and interoperability. Digitization is the digital transformation can be a fantastic tool for businesses to help manage their supply chains, manage their data, really understand what is going on in their supply chains and find opportunities for efficiency. But the reality is, as new technologies get developed, if they get developed in a silo and don't consider how they are going to interact with other software or hardware in that same ecosystem, it can actually create more issues with data exchange and increase cost, time, and effort in order to make sure that data is usable and shareable. So benefits, again, you've got benefits for really everyone in the supply chain, from the production side of improving efficiency, reducing the administrative burden of redundant data capture, distribution, logistics, and consumer side of things, obviously enhanced traceability, a better understanding of how your supply chains are operating, a better way to identify risks. And then also for the IT and technology professionals, it really helps, having a standard really helps them understand the guidelines. They can still be as creative as they want in creating their product for their particular customer, but on the back end of things, what data do they need to be able to to receive, how does that data need to be formatted, how are they sharing that data out, is incredibly important for broad implementation. Because there are barriers to digitization. So I'm going to focus on interoperability and integration today. But obviously, in these supply chains, you do have uneven digital transformation. There are concerns with data privacy and security, accuracy and consistency. But without interoperability or a way to really share that data between supply chain partners, none of this really matters. And so what do I mean when I say interoperability? I mean global interoperability, where there's the ability of software systems to exchange and interpret data without the need for human intervention. Obviously, this is very critical in these widespread cattle supply chains to have a scalable way to achieve interoperability and have that full supply chain traceability. So there's essentially historically 3 approaches that the industry's taken to interoperability, which I'm going to dive into in a second. Single system approach, essentially one solution to rule them all, customization, and then of course standardization. So the way that this looks, I'm a visual learner, so I hope this maybe helps to kind of illustrate the point. But the single system approach, if you're a supply chain owner, is the obvious approach for you. If you've got a system that works well for you, why not make everybody else use it? But the problem lies when you've got a number of different supply chain owners all using different systems and demanding that their suppliers use that same system in order to exchange data with them. What the result is you have a huge burden on the middle of the supply chain where they have to sign up for 3, 4, 5, 10 different licenses, depending on what their customers are demanding. They're essentially putting the same data in throughout every single one of those systems, which can be very costly from, again, having people just administratively doing this, and then also the licensing fees. The other drawback to this approach is the suppliers lose leverage very quickly, and so they can't demand the same sort of request on their suppliers that they all sign up for these different licenses and softwares. And so essentially you have no digitization beyond maybe tier 1 or tier 2 in these supply chains. The next approach is customization. So essentially this refers to adapting software systems to enable data exchange. This is a one-off sort of API custom integration between 2 different systems. This can work if you're talking about a very small number of systems that need to communicate. But in this example, if you've got 10 different software that need to communicate, it means there's 45 unique integrations. And when you scale that to the food system, that very quickly becomes unruly, unwieldy, and way too costly in order to take this approach. So the final approach, of course, is standardization, which establishes that uniform framework for data exchange, enabling seamless communication between systems. So if you have your system that follows a standard, you will be interoperable with any other system that is following that same standard. It supports the development of scalable tools and open source resources, making it easier for all parties to adopt and implement these standards efficiently. So now I'm going to focus on some of the learnings that we've had from the seafood sector, kind of go through some of the resources and tools that they've put together that I think can be leveraged for pushing this cattle initiative forward. So the first one is knowledge content. Not everybody is a traceability expert, that's for sure. And so the GDST has put together a comprehensive body of knowledge. Of course, there's the open source actual technical standard for traceability that they have, but there's also knowledge content ranging from, implementation guidelines to what is event-based traceability and why are standards important. Because the reality is these implementations happen through industry engagement with their supply chain partners. So to be able to have resources on hand that they can share in plain language of what they're trying to accomplish is incredibly important. There's also a lot of resources on there for technical professionals. And when we say technical professionals, it's more on the IT development side, right? Because that is a critical component in all of this, supporting the IT staff, supporting the solution providers that are engaging on this towards interoperability. So there is a wide array of technical resources, including developer documentation, API specifications, and they really help to get the solution providers to meet the traceability standard much more quickly, much more easily. Kind of building off of those resources, the GDST has also created software development kits. So these are open source kits to help solution provider understand the data models that are required, understand how to map from maybe the data models that are used by a solution provider to the required CTEs and KDEs from the seafood standard, and then also just open source utility code that they can apply to try to get to interoperable much more quickly. I think one of the really key tools or tests is actually what it more is that the GDST has created is what they call the capability test. So in 2020, the standard was released. The standard was created by the industry through industry dialogues to really determine, what those critical tracking events were, what the KDEs needed to be for seafood. And when it was released, the industry immediately said, okay, who do we need to work with from the technology side who's implemented this? And all the GDST really had at that point in time was, a sign-on letter from solution providers that had about 30 different technologies on there that said, we support the GDST standards, we stand behind this. And so we pointed them to that list and said, they are aware of this and they seem to support it. Maybe that's your best bet. Well, we quickly came to realize that there's a lot more to implementation, testing, and assurance that we needed to do beyond just an endorsement from the solution provider community through pilots that lasted months that resulted in inability to actually exchange data. So we thought about what we could actually do to test these solutions, because otherwise we would really have to do a deep dive in their back end to see how their software operated. So came up with the concept of the capability test, which is a dummy traceability software. And what it does is connects with a commercial solution, sends a packet of data, receives that packet back, analyzes that all the data has been received back and in the correct format. And from that simple sort of testing back and forth, we then know that a solution A is able to capture all the data that's required from the standard. They've done it in a way that they can receive it, store it, and share it in the correct format. And they can connect using that standardized communication protocol. So it checks all the boxes for interoperability. That is an automated test that takes less than a second to complete. And if they do fail the test, they get a report back saying exactly what went wrong so that they can go make any modifications they need to pass the test. And so what do we learn from somebody passing the test? Well, if somebody has passed the capability test, that means that they are then interoperable with anyone else who has also passed the test, which is incredibly important to advancing kind of the mission of digital interoperable traceability in these supply chains. So now I'm going to talk about the work that we've been involved with again since December, but it's building off of research and reports that's been done, for years and years and years. So we have in fact mapped the CTEs and KDEs for beef and leather supply chains. This slide is not meant for anybody to read, obviously. It's more just illustrative that we've got the cattle supply chain here on the left, the beef supply chain up top, and then the leather supply chain at the bottom. And so essentially, as part of what's going to be talked about later in the roadmap, this is a draft that we've done that we really want to kick the tires on with the industry to make sure that it does actually capture all the different activities that are happening in these supply chains. That the data elements that we've listed here make sense, that we're not missing anything. So we put this together. It is fairly comprehensive, but it's certainly going to be a tool that we use with engagement with the industry moving forward. So zooming in a little bit, we didn't only want to list all the CTEs and KDEs. We also wanted to give a little bit of context. So for each of the critical tracking events that we came up with, we also included information about how frequently they need to be captured, an example of what we mean by that critical tracking event, as well as a list of all the KDEs with example data in there as well, to really help users understand the story that we're trying to tell through this event-based framework. So zooming in even a little bit further, just so you can really understand the work that we've done. Here's an example critical tracking event. What was going on? The company Fine Leather Goods created handbags from finished leather on June 5th, 2024. That critical tracking event is a transformation event from the raw material of finished leather goods into the handbag finished product. The frequency at which data would be collected would be for each lot of finished products that are created. So the example of the key data elements, the who, what, when, where, and why, are who, Fine Leather Goods. They were the company that was doing this transformation event. What did they use? The input was finished leather. There would be a product ID associated with that leather, that would be related to the color, quality, other aspects of it. Quantity of square feet, and what batch or lot of finished leather did that come from? What was the output? It was the handbags. Those handbags are going to have a certain product identification depending on the model of handbag. There were 20 of them that were created. The unit of measure is each. And then there's going to be a batch, a lot, or even a serial number associated with that set of handbags. Where did this happen? There's going to be a unique location ID for that particular facility. Of course, the address, and then the name Fine Leather Goods was the actual facility. And then the when and the why, right? When did this happen? The why is what sort of business step was it? It was a transformation event from a raw material to a finished good. So with that, we've gone through the sort of framework that can be used in these contexts. I think hopefully provided some good examples from the seafood industry, as well as shown you the work that we've done in trying to start building towards a standard. At the basis of it is this critical tracking event KDE framework that we can start to build off of, start to define how those data elements are captured, and then also the communications, how are they going to be communicated between systems. So still certainly a lot of work to do, but I think we've set ourselves up with a really good head start. So I'm going to hand it back over to Jason.
Thank you. So I want to talk just a little bit about the work that we've done to this point in the field and just contextualize for everyone, just so everyone's aware. And then afterwards, we'll be taking questions that everyone has in this process. So The work that we've done, and you can see me there in that funny hat, as well as some of the shots that we took. We have lots of other shots that we'll be able to send some links about. But yeah, over a period of years, we work in the field quite a lot in Brazil, because that's a very big concern to many on the call. But also we've done some work with producers in Australia. And we really looked to kind of field test this and find the various holes and gaps, and the things that this framework needs to fill. And maybe Blake, if you can go to that next slide. So we really worked across different stakeholders, specifically upstream in the supply chain. And I just illustrated that here, and also the various critical tracking events that Blake mentioned, how those were expressed very early on in the supply chain. And again, this is a very simple example. All these supply chains are very different. The fact is that you don't just go from birth farm to then a feed yard to then straight to a meat processor. You got many intermediary pathways in between, and that's part of the issue, is that these supply chains are so varied. You really have to have a tool set and a framework that accounts for that variation, so that it can be used across different systems. So what we did was we worked with these various stakeholders. We did interviews on the ground with farmers. We considered the various tools that they had access to, internet accessibility, et cetera. Same thing with feed yards. What are their existing practices within those organizations? What are the various tools that they have access to? And then on to meat processors and tanneries. And similarly, what were the various systems they used? And how does the product move within the four walls of those groups? Now, this also went across geographies, like I said. So we weren't just looking at one specific geography, even though we did really focus on those that were of most critical concern. Brazil primarily, and also Australia. And then across different use cases and concerns. So you've got regulatory concerns, both local and international. You've got things like environmental concerns and the information that brands want to know based on the traceability, and they want to be able to verify. You've also got social concerns. And even, when you consider the beef industry, you've got food safety concerns. And so all of these need to be thought through and accounted for with a framework like this, so that it can be valuable to each of these industries and each of these different stakeholders throughout the supply chain. Most importantly, what we looked at was how data can be shared downstream. Because we can take these initiatives around things like mapping and tagging, et cetera, but if data isn't shared downstream, those are stuck in a silo. If they can't be connected to the brands, they become not very useful to the brands. And so to be able to have this framework that can connect all the way downstream to the various stakeholders that are using those ultimately into consumer products, again, whether in the food system or in the fashion industry, et cetera, without that consideration, that's really some of the holdup. And that means being able to connect across systems. So much of our work was using our tool, WholeChain. And you'll see that in some of the links that we'll send out in just a minute. We've got a YouTube video and a blog post, but then also a case study by GS1 that you can read more about this. But it wasn't done for our tool. That was just the context. In fact, we researched different tools used along the supply chain. And interestingly, we found very different definitions of even what traceability is, some of the data collected, certain gaps that were in different systems. But then the focus of this was, well, how could we create a common framework so that, just as Blake was mentioning earlier, not one system would need to be used, but any of these various systems. So if you consider the tool set that might be available from a feed yard and then onto a meat processor, the ERP at the meat processing facility, how can data be shared between those different systems onto the tannery, et cetera, on downstream, so that there doesn't have to be a custom integration or a requirement that one system be used, but data can be shared across. And I think the best example of that is email. I don't ask people that I'm communicating with, hey, can I send you a Gmail? Can you open it with your Gmail? I need you all of my friends, please use Gmail. I don't say anything like that. I just say, I'm going to send you an email. And they're able to open that with whatever email system they want to use. That's the same type of data transmission that can occur across supply chains. And that's the very purpose of this. So we're going to take questions in just a minute. And so, Joe, I'll hand that over to you in terms of leading that. but I'm sure you have many. I think, we've done a lot of work to this point, and more work needs to be done, and taking this into brands and some of the stakeholders that are involved in this call. So.
Yeah, so please share your questions on the Q&A. We have a couple here. One from Sarah from Mars Pet Care. Does this also include category 3 byproducts as well? So asking in their case what category 3 might be. And also, does it include traceability for cow calf, stocker, feeder, etc.? So those were 2 questions.
Yeah, we also looked at byproducts. Honestly, the supply chain has got so many that it's hard to look at every single one of them, but absolutely that is, and that's part of the reason why taking this framework approach is so important, because then it can account for some of those byproducts, and you see that across different industries. Blake mentioned the global dialogue on seafood traceability. The same exact thing happens, and specifically in pet care, where you have a lot of times you're dealing with a byproduct within that industry. And yeah, it's very important, and that's why this approach is so important.
Yeah, my understanding is we're starting off today focused on beef and leather, but there are other byproducts for pharma, for cosmetics, etc. That once you have traceability, into that facility, you can treat all those byproducts that are coming out of that same facility.
And those byproduct systems, more importantly, can consume the data because we're taking a framework approach. If it was all just, the leather trace approach and everyone got on board, what happens when we get outside of leather? And that also weakens it for the leather supply chain when you think about it, because then they have to get other industries to buy into that, which may not be as relevant to them.
And Blake, maybe another one to add on to does it go to cow, calf, stocker, feeder, etc. And also the question about documentation required, say for each CTE, etc. Is that included in the framework?
Yeah, and so it does go back to cow calf. Certainly what we've done so far. In terms of the documentation requirements, I think this is kind of one of those paradigm shifts, right? Where a lot of organizations think about traceability specifically related to what documents they're sharing with their supply chain partners. And you're sharing those documents because those documents have data on them, and hopefully they have the data that is identified through these critical tracking events and key data elements. So we think about it less as documents-based traceability and more as data-based traceability. Do those documents include those data elements, right? Ensuring that they do, but then also ensuring that you're recording those data elements, and maybe it reduces the need to even exchange documentation as you're actually exchanging that information digitally through integration with your supply chain partners.
Yeah, that's exactly what we saw in practice, where some systems have the documentation. There's a geolocation in the documentation, but not necessarily a field. You're smiling because you've seen this before. Not necessarily a field in the system,
Right.
Which I imagine for interoperability is a nightmare, because then you have to be going through documents for information,
Exactly,
like geolocation, in order to get traceability. Super. Just going through here for other questions. There's several questions about sharing information, one-pagers, etc. That's why we included the link to the form. Please identify yourself, who's interested in what, so we're not bombarding everybody with information that they're not interested in. But we will have several documentation following this event, a white paper, on the piece itself, on the framework itself, and we're looking to. There's another question about kind of language. The CTEs are called different things in different places, etc. I imagine this is part of this testing period. We've got an initial version. We're using that in practice, and it's exactly these kinds of definitions that we want to hone over the coming year in using the framework. So we've got that language that all system providers are using, etc. I imagine that's part of the process as well. We've got something initial, we need to test it out in different geographies.
absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And is that something similar that you've seen in other sectors as well, right? Hashing out
I mean,
languages.
yeah, thinking about, seafood, which is where I've spent a lot of my time. Um, any country that's got a coastline has a seafood industry. And so ensuring sort of that consistency in the language that's being used about what is really being required, I think is why this framework is so powerful. And and when we say languages, it could be translating it into different languages is going to be incredibly important so that people on the ground really understand the meaning behind it. But that is certainly part of this next pilot testing phase to see where we need to focus those efforts.
There are a lot of questions on a kind of very specific application, like the things that happen in practice. And I think it's hard for us to respond to all of those. I think that those are really responded to, and Earl can attest to this. In application, we kind of get into a lot of these questions of, how are different products treated within the facility, operationally, how you do this, how can you include the scale of all the producers that are involved. A lot of these are operational questions that in the implementation and pilots, we kind of end up treating those. Also questions about this, related initiatives or databases, again, in the application, in the pilots, and in the implementation. We come across those in different geographies. They have to do with the operational context. And that's where we're really kind of treating those aspects and incorporating it in the approach, and then taking that learning and what's relevant to the framework itself. Some of them are just operationally how you're doing it in a given geography. And then some of those things are actually relevant to definitions in the framework itself, et cetera. And so, that's part of the idea of having pilot testing in practice, on the ground, in operations, taking that learning and bringing it over to the framework so it's captured in the framework that's being used to align these different systems.
Yeah, and I mean, I would just also add, we are really building off of 8 years of experience in the seafood industry through this global dialogue on seafood traceability, where seafood supply chains can be some of the most complex supply chains in the world, where I would imagine a lot of these operational questions are going to have analogous scenarios in seafood too. So I think it's not just, pilot testing and thinking about it there. It's that I would imagine we've already thought through many of these scenarios just in a different context.
We're getting a ton of questions.
Yeah,
So
that's great.
There's one, Samantha Worth had one about the US context that I think is really illustrative of why this is so important. I'm just going to read part of it, just, how you factor for over 600,000 individual cattle farmers and ranchers and 20,000 individual feed yards. That is the reason this framework approach is so important. I think what you see in the US cattle industry is actually very similar practices. And if you really drill down, you'd see very similar systems in terms of their function. And yet they can't communicate. The practice of using ear tags, if you drive across and see different pastures in the United States, you'd see, ear tags across these different pastures, but yet they're not communicating from a common language. So they really can't pass that data, always downstream. Similarly with some of these systems, and that's why you have frameworks like EPCIS, like what GS1 does, is it creates that standardization. And a great example of that is the barcode itself. I can walk into a Walmart and I can pull something off the shelf and I can carry it into a 7-Eleven and scan it. And I'll get pricing information, product description, et cetera, about that because they're each using a common framework. They didn't have to use the same system. And that's the really important thing, is within the context of all this diversity, that common framework really provides a leveling where these systems can work together.
And also, when you get into the framework for a given actor, it's very specific information that's being requested. Many times that information is already available. It's just not included in a traceability system. It might be in documentation, et cetera. And also, a lot of it can be automated. I mean, a lot of it is, within a system, you can automate, okay, what's the location and what's the product, et cetera. So when you get into kind of the details and the weeds of the framework, you can see that what we're talking about here is core traceability. So, just the basics of what you need in order to have rigorous traceability. And for each actor, that's a very tight set of information that potentially can be automated and many times already exists.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just a comment.
I just have a comment here, Joe. I saw two questions here related to incentives. One is after the standards create, if there would be any incentives for farmers to implement it. And I also saw another similar question related to tanneries, traders not wanting to disclose their supply chains. In the end of the day, it's clear, it's important to make clear that not everyone will adopt traceability, but what we are talking about is for those who want to adopt, it's easier when you have standards. So you don't have to be working, as Blake mentioned, working with different approaches and which makes it more burdensome. But in terms of incentives, we've been working. We had some work we've done with Hever and Holy Chain, which we're looking at different ways of incentivizing transparent supply chains. There isn't one single solution. That sometimes this is really about business relationships. It's about how the supply chains are set. Some places traceability is mandatory. In some places, you see companies paying some incentives for traceability. In others, it's just about getting access to better markets. So there isn't a single way, but yes, we see incentives as an important part for this. We have a fund we are creating right now to support the adoption of some of those approaches. But the most important is that when those things are being adopted, we need to make sure they are done with avoiding excess of work and really having these standards in place.
Super. Yeah, and I just want to reiterate, we're going to keep the questions coming. These are great. And we're going to turn this into kind of a document so we can respond to them formally. And also if you include your identification and stuff, that's helpful. We know like who's asking the question and who's interested in what, et cetera. I'm also seeing a couple of questions here on EUDR. I thought, Earl, I might throw that to you, kind of understanding of like how this responds to EUDR, what is the potential, and how is this relevant to something like EUDR?
Yeah, so I can share just a little bit of a tapestry perspective on this. In terms of EUDR, we've sort of interpreted the regulation to mean that we're going to need geocoordinates back to the farm across the board, regardless of country or region of origin, and that then becomes a starting off point that enables the due diligence statement that corresponds to the geocoordinate. And so this alone is not the due diligence work, but it's the facilitation of capturing geolocation back to the farm that then you can layer on top of the due diligence work to ensure that there's no deforestation or other practices that would make material, leather in particular, subject to not being importable or exportable out of the EU. So this is not like a silver bullet, but it's a very necessary piece. And I think our interpretation has been, though please talk to your own legal counsels and representative organizations, that if you don't have the geocoordinates, that's going to be the stop sign right there. And so if you can't reliably capture that information, either through a system like this that facilitates getting back to the geocoordinates specific to the ear tags that are part of the lots that your leather or beef is coming from, or that you're not using a system like this to facilitate like a supply shed model or a catchment basin model, that's going to really hamper your ability to do any further due diligence in that supply chain.
So maybe we'll go through the roadmap and implementation and come back to some questions? Because I know some people on the call might have to drop off too.
Yeah, I did want to comment on one point just before we move on, because someone mentioned chain of custody, and I just want to differentiate between chain of custody and what we're talking about here with the chain of events. A chain of custody is great when you're dealing with one thing that stays one thing. But as soon as that changes, as soon as something like a transformation happens, or any type of other types of events that happen, this event-based process, that's why it's so important. And so if we were just talking about live cattle, for example, moving between different facilities, chain of custody works fine. As soon as live cattle becomes, goes into a meat processor, you have multiple products coming out, that transformation process, that's where a chain of events that is varied according to the potential of what the different processes happen in that supply chain. That's where that's necessary, and that's why this approach, we've taken that event-based traceability approach.
Super. So let's just go a little bit through the roadmap, how we're imagining implementing this. And then, also, please continue with your questions and fill out the form. There's several questions about kind of the details of what's in the framework, et cetera. And by getting your contact information, we can make sure that you get that information and documentation. I think that will be helpful for answering a lot of those questions. And really, we found along these years, this back and forth on these questions is really important for alignment, for improving the framework itself. I mean, basically in this back and forth is where we are building global traceability for the beef and leather sector. So it's an important part of the process. I'm Joe Selwood from Revere. In English, it's known as Reflect. I'm the lead for deforestation-free supply for the Better Food Future. The next slide, a little bit just on Better Food Futures. Mark talked about it a bit, but in practice, it's a platform for collaboration like this. This launch is actually a result of a series of events and meetings of Better Food Future that happened. It was originally launched under the UNGC Ocean Stewardship Coalition because of advancements in seafood, and now we're bringing those to other sectors. So it's a platform for collaboration like this, and the reason why that's important and how that works, there's some examples here. Co-investment, if every single one of these industries and products that we were talking about were to, try to set up their own supply chain or own traceability systems, obviously that would be a 10x investment as opposed to coordinating this through standardization. That's why the standards piece is so important. That also reduces costs because then systems can work together rather than in silos. And so there's less repetition of those systems, and that's a huge cost reducer as well. Cross-sector collaboration, we're looking to do that in this work itself. We have a coalition of buyers on the beef side and the leather side that we will be starting a new round of using the framework in order to request information. And so that will be going out to beef operations, and at a certain point, that'll split off into multiple products, including leather. And at first, it'll be just exchange of learning between those buyers and suppliers in using this framework. But we imagine very quickly it'll actually be connecting with the same operations, finding operations that are using this and having the traceability data, and they can offer beef, leather, and other products. Reinvestment, as Mark pointed out, many of the buyers, they share same suppliers. So, as these buyers and suppliers are aligning, in one case that is often applicable to multiple brands within that sector. So getting one pair up to speed, we're actually getting a bunch of brands up to speed. And investments in Better Food Future are through a 501, so those are reinvested into sustainable supply chains. And finally, the public-private, being positioned within the UN, Better Food Future is well positioned in order to coordinate those conversations. We're going to be doing pilots and implementation in scaling this in the marketplace. And that's a forum where we can advance the discussions that are happening with public agencies so that they can support that work. So on the next slide, we really are looking to draw from the experience, obviously, of setting up the GDST, which took, I don't know, what are the estimates, 16 years or something like that, 15 plus. We're looking to boil 10 years down into about 18 months. We may not get there, but with the help of everyone on the call, we might come very close. We think there's a lot of learning from GDST that we can replicate here and get results much quicker. And so looking at GDST and how it was rolled out and established, these 5 key pillars of action come into play. So first, obviously, the framework, as we commented, we have an initial version. We'll be sending that out. That lays out CTEs and KDEs, but we want to refine that in practice in different geographies with this group of buyers and suppliers that will be kicking off now. So the pilots and the practice will be informing the framework development and advancement. Also, the technology assessment, as Blake laid out, very important in order to make this work in practice. And there is a lot we can draw from there and apply to beef and leather very quickly. Industry adoption and advocacy, obviously, implicit in standard. The word standard means it needs to be used broadly. So we want to get the word out among all the agencies, initiatives, industry groups, traceability efforts, commitments in the relationship and how this data framework complements a lot of the work going on in different geographies and in different industries. We really see this as a complement. And finally, kind of the governance piece of building a home for the initiative, for the framework, having structure for feedback and financing in order to manage, sustain, and implement beef and leather traceability. So on the next slide, this is kind of from our discussion so far, what we're planning for the next 12 to 18 months in terms of activity and results that we hope to see. Again, drawing from the GDST experience, this is the pathway that we see. We have an initial version, getting consultation with that, as we're sending it out. We are planning a series of participation in a series of events. We're already participating in the beef and leather industry and also in traceability. We hope to hold working sessions with stakeholders at those events and virtually in order to get feedback on the framework itself. We really want to involve a broad array of industry groups, companies using it, NGOs, specialists, all of you here on the call in order to provide that feedback. Release by the end of the year a version of the framework itself, finalized with all that feedback and information, and establish a process for revision. This is not kind of a one and done effort. The standard needs to evolve as technology evolves, as regulation, environment evolves, and as adoption evolves. The needs change, and that needs to be incorporated in the framework as well. On the next slide, as far as results in this area, the publication of the framework itself, publicly available to companies and system providers, as well as implementation, documentation, and guides in order to help with the adoption. The next slide, as I commented, well, this is ongoing, already happening, a lot of these pilots, so it's immediately actionable. You don't need to wait a year or two in order to get started with this. It's already being put into practice, as Earl mentioned his experience. And that has been a focus from the beginning of drawing from practice and informing the framework itself. And so that will continue. We're kicking off a new round of applications of the framework with a coalition of company partners, of buyers on the beef and leather side to start. But pilots will be ongoing, so the more the merrier, and you can join and get started at any time. And if you're interested, please reach out and let us know. We'll be analyzing the results of this round and the other pilots and consolidating that and providing that to inform the framework itself and incorporate that and have published findings of the applications. The results, next slide in this area.
Here.
Oh, the brand commitment. So yeah, we couldn't get through all the legal departments in time for this call, but we have a very strong coalition of beef and leather buyers and suppliers. This includes a full array, footwear, accessories, auto, food brands, food service, distributors, restaurants, cruise lines. So we really trying to cover the full array of beef and leather products. So we're covering the full spectrum of prime, subprime cuts, or different grades of leather and application. And so we'll be starting this next round of implementation immediately following this launch. Next slide. So on this new round, it'll involve a very basic scope of work that consists of sharing the current traceability data request that follows the framework, the beef and leather traceability data framework, sharing that with suppliers, choosing those suppliers in some cases, and in most cases, that choice has already been made. And that's really when a time of feedback happens between the suppliers and the brands, and that is very helpful in learning and structuring the way we put this into practice. It's in that back and forth where we have this clarification of terms, of structure, what data is currently being collected. Obviously, a format is a big item to align. What's not being collected, what's absolutely necessary, what would easily be collected is maybe even already available. It's just not available in the right form or in the reporting format. So that back and forth is really the core of the learning of the application. Eventually, we get to a stage where we have data available from the supplier. That can be in a variety of formats. We have a basic Excel, and it can be done manually just by informing in that Excel, or it can be pulling reports from a system or different systems, even national systems, in order to provide that data and make it available to the buyer. We then analyze the data being provided, much like the tool tester Blake described. We're doing this manually. Analyze that data provided, and then provide feedback to the supplier and the buyer as to how close we are and recommended steps in order to achieve interoperability and traceability data in a way that follows the standard. As I mentioned, at this point, we are focused on what we're calling core traceability. So that's just the critical tracking events that define traceability, and also the core basic key data elements for those tracking events. This also is kind of learning from the GDST, where there was a kind of a single issue focus on illegality. And so in this case, instead of having just that focus on, say, deforestation, we're really just striving to have rigorous traceability. That is the tracks that all of these issues, anything that's farm level, needs in order to run upon. And so obviously, having suppliers and buyers that have the same data structure allows you to connect traceability with all kinds of other systems that can treat those issues. And so obviously in Brazil, in our work, the focus has really been on deforestation and how traceability can be used in order to identify a product that is deforestation free. But this is also useful for other issues and topics. And Wednesday, I'd like to ask you to share a little bit of your experience here in the US of the relevance of traceability to the issue of, say, emissions.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I think it's what we found is that it's critical to engage producers and companies around issues that they already care about when we're dealing with traceability. So back to those questions we mentioned earlier around what are the types of benefits for farmers. We think the best way to answer that is to focus these type of pilots and testing of the framework around topics and issues that we know producers and companies care about and that may affect their bottom line. So obviously deforestation and market access to the EU is one important driver for that. Whilst in the US there might be other topics that can spur action more immediately. So that could be differentiation around particular claims, low carbon beef, regenerative practices, grass-fed, etc. And we started a project last year that focused on the low carbon claims piece. So working with a few different companies across the beef supply chain, buying kind of quite different parts from the carcass, we try to identify the issues of what's preventing them from making verifiable claims around farm level greenhouse gas emissions and removals associated with cattle production in the US. And all the companies involved clearly understand that there's a big greenhouse gas footprint associated with beef. They also see that the potential for emission reductions as well as carbon removals through soil, in particular land management practices, is substantial. So what we found in that study was that one of the three biggest challenges to realize this opportunity of making verifiable greenhouse gas claims based on farm level activity was interoperable traceability. So we're looking now to sort of test this framework in that context. So just reiterating the issue that Joe just said, that the framework we're presenting here would provide the kind of infrastructure, the core traceability components, which events are we tracking, what core activities are we tracking, and then for this particular purpose, you would have to overlay that core traceability data with specific greenhouse gas and carbon emissions and removals data as a secondary step. But we see, so it's just a great example, we think, of how we can utilize a common framework, an interoperable framework like this, to achieve another goal that might be more front and center for many producers and companies in that sector.
Super. So next slide. The results that we're looking to achieve in this area, 50% of market actors in priority markets actively using the traceability framework. That might seem like a staggering goal, but if we kind of look at who we already have agreements with in priority markets in order to use this, it comes very close to that. And we're just saying that those actors are using the framework in order to standardize the collection, not that we're going to be achieving deforestation-free supply by the end of the year, et cetera. But that's a very important step. I mean, if we have 50% of the market that's using a common data framework in order to share information, that's really scaling this rather than having a bunch of data silos. And that informs how these systems will be developed. And so by making it explicit how traceability is defined and what are the core key data elements for each event, that's taking us a long way to having these systems reach a point where they're interoperable, where they can share information, and that's what achieves scale and progress, right? We're looking to have that standardization also for the overlay of deforestation-free tools by the end of the year. And by having standardized systems, that also allows for the connection between traceability and those tools. And the technology assessment, which Blake has talked about, this is where we really feel like we can make quick progress given what's already been developed. And so this is the process kind of which we went through with GDST, mapping the tools that are out there, looking specifically at geospatial, given the commitments of companies, and then having and making this validation tool, as Blake described, where it can test platforms to make sure that they follow the framework and also provide feedback to companies and those systems in what gaps need to be filled in order to achieve interoperability. So given that prior experience, that's something that we feel we can achieve over the next 12 to 18 months. And the results in this area, which we're hoping for, is to release this traceability tool tester that could be used by beef and leather companies. Also, what has been very helpful is a whole host of tools for providers in order to make this happen in practice. And there are a bunch of tech terms here of having the GitHub, and you love acronyms, and that the software development kits, API specifications, etc. There's just a lot that can be provided to make this easier and get those systems up to speed with the framework and interoperable. And also we want to have a suite of geospatial tools that can plug in, at least identify by the end of the year, so those can work together with traceability systems. We really don't need to reinvent anything there. Next slide on industry adoption. This is an area, of course, where we're really counting on everybody on this call and beyond. For the standard to be a standard, it needs widespread adoption. We're going to be having a lot of companies using this in practice, but we need that to get out to different groups, industries, specialists, all of you that are working in the beef and leather. We know of a lot of these initiatives that are going on. We really feel like this is complementary to a lot of those efforts. A lot of the questions in the chat, mention these, and we see this as supporting a lot of those initiatives. We are identifying a calendar of events already where we'll be participating. We'll have material and participating in those events in order to communicate the importance of standardized traceability for the beef and leather sector. As far as results in this area, we'd like to see some of our partners, some of you on the call, using this obviously in practice, publicly endorsing it in your different forums and initiatives. We'll have training resources available specifically for advocacy on standardization within the sector. That's been very helpful in other food segments. And also the relevance of this to specific regulatory requirements and voluntary initiatives that are happening, and incorporate this into those efforts as well. Finally, on the in-house piece on governance, as I'm losing my voice, getting close to the end. So yeah, this is putting the house together in order to maintain this and keep everything going. Establish a steering committee with many of you participating on the call in order to inform direction. Having a decision-making framework. A lot of this is pretty standard. It's what we saw happen with the GDST in order to become functional. Having a funding strategy and putting that into practice as well. And the results here is just having that home clearly established with the roles and responsibilities, having the structure necessary in order to promote industry adoption, also having a mixed finance strategy where we can leverage what companies are investing in pilots and making this happen on the ground, and public sources in order to fill any gaps that are needed for implementation. And finally, have established our KPIs so we can measure impact and show our ROI on the investments and the activities of the initiative itself. So that's just a high level view of what we're imagining over the next 12 or 18 months. And I think we have a little more space for some questions and comments as well. Jay?
Yeah, and I just wanted to jump in. There were some questions that were coming up about existing systems. And no, this is not meant to be a replacement necessarily for existing systems, but rather an enhancement of existing systems. In fact, I think one of the things you'll find, because it builds upon, this is not a new standard. This is building upon a standard that's in existence, that's been in use for decades across industries, as well as the underlying identification schema. So if you were to go inside a meat packer across the globe, you would find barcodes and also identifiers called a GTIN, a Global Trade Identification Number. This is well within the GS1 framework. These are already in use, and in many cases already in use in certain systems within those meat packers. Additionally, you'll find on pallet labels something called an SSCC, a serialized shipping container code. This is also part of that identification schema. So what we're doing is building upon not like creating some new framework so that systems can talk, but taking something that's been used in pharmaceuticals and food. It's being used by the Food and Drug Administration and others, and taking that decades-old framework and now applying it to this circumstance where there's already going to be remnants of that within certain of these systems, because those same systems are being used in those other industries as well. And for those that aren't, their ability to then utilize these tools that Joe just mentioned that are being provided, then they can build those onto those tools, as opposed to people having to, replace the tools that they have in their various facilities.
Yeah, this is like a compliment to like certification that we see. Like in Brazil, we see a lot of protocols of certifications. Really, in practice, you start to see this is complementary to that certification. It's basically how can the data that's being collected or used within that effort can be structured in a way where it can be shared with other systems. And also in practice, there'll be national databases that can be a source of information. That's complementary because it's how can you pull information from those databases and include it in a system. So really in practice, in each different context or location, we see how this initiative on a data framework is complementary to a lot of things that are happening in different places. Are there any other questions from the chat that would be worth? Most recent one.
I think maybe if Blake or Jason, more of the technical people, can answer that. There are some questions about how the data is stored and shared and how confidentiality is treated. I think there is a confusion between creating a traceability system and standardizing data that is collected and shared. If you can just differentiate that, I think it's important to avoid that confusion.
Yeah, I guess. All right, so I guess I would say from this perspective of kind of data security, transparency, what we're proposing provides a pathway for data sharing. Each of the individual actors would be, storing and maintaining their own data and then allowing access to their particular supply chain partner. So it's not that all the data is being sucked up into one big database, or that every single thing that's getting recorded is being exposed. And that's actually one of the really big benefits of using this approach. Whereas you think about it from the perspective of, documents-based traceability, you say, hey, I need you to give me X, Y, and Z documents. They may contain much more data than is actually required from a traceability perspective. including pricing data. And once you hand that document off to your supply chain partner, essentially you have no control of what happens to it any longer. In the perspective from digital interoperable traceability, you can put all types of restrictions on data access, who has access to what, when they have access to it, and how much data they have access to. So in fact, from the data autonomy, it remains autonomous to the independent supply chain actor that is creating the data, and they get to essentially decide who and what they're sharing that data with. So I hope that maybe answers the question around that.
Yeah, and I can just step into just a little bit of additional information is that this enables the capability to share data, but it doesn't mandate that data be shared or how it's shared or what is shared. It also, by taking this framework approach, it enables different stakeholders in the supply chain to understand better what is best practice in terms of what to collect, those key data elements, and where that data should be collected to have, minimally a standard of traceability, but then additional elements that could be collected, like what Erstein mentioned earlier around specific concerns. So it almost leaves that issue up to the individual solution providers within the supply chain and the individual systems, but allows them to at least connect. A good example of that, I think, like you mentioned, but just Wi-Fi. When you connect to a Wi-Fi anywhere, you're really connecting based upon a data standard. If you go to, electronics store and just go to look at some Wi-Fi routers, you'll see the standard by which they do connect. If it's Wi-Fi 6, 802.11e, these are all data standards. They're all protocols for connecting to a system. That's what this does.
There are a couple questions on the involvement of producers, kind of the upstream part of the chain. I would say, just one comment I would say, in practice, again, I think we have a lot of great questions here, by the way. So, and we'll be getting back to you on. But in practice, what needs to be collected is very basic and usually already collected. But I do think it's a huge issue, and it has to do with incentives. What Fernando commented before, and Fernando, if you want to say more, I think they're really incentivizing the producers to participate and to share their data, et cetera. That's really key, and there are efforts going on with that. Again, this complements that. This is really focused on just making sure that the data itself is in a format that can be shared across systems that can lead to scale, instead of just being maintained in one system and requires everybody in the world to just use that one system. But yeah, I think on the producer front, on involvement, incentives is going to be very key in order to have them involved. But in practice, the information that we're collecting is very basic, and it's usually already available with activity that is currently going on. Fernando, I don't know if you want to say anything additional on incentives.
I just think it's important that there are some questions about the systems that already exist in some places, but also this idea that it's something that's being created by brands, but how we can ensure that producers are engaged on that. In the end of the day, there are different demands that are driving towards traceability. You have legal demands, you have market requirements, and you have brands asking for traceability. And there are systems already. Chico from NWF also mentioned the systems that already exist in Brazil. So for me, it's very important to make 2 points clear. We are not trying to replace those things, but just making sure that those systems that already exist, they can connect to each other. And the other one, it may not apply to everyone, but you see producers that are already engaged in sharing information, that you see places where this is already mandatory. So what we want to do by standardizing those approaches is making sure that when there is this interest in exchange information, it's done in a seamless way.
I think two sort of ideas need to maybe be held in a little bit of tension. At least it was helpful for us in thinking about this. The first idea is that this work has been done. It's been established. There's something to build on that works in other spaces and other industries, and is in a lot of ways, to Jason's point, being used in these supply chains already. That is true. At the same time, there is the need to ensure the applicability of this to the unique realities, the existing systems, the unengaged or yet to be engaged supply chains, to collect their feedback, to engage them, to make alterations, to tailor what's worked in other spaces to the cattle industry, beef and leather. So I think, again, you've got to sort of hold those two ideas together, that we can use everything that seafood and pharmaceuticals have learned to inform the approach, but there's still a need to do the work. And it seems exciting, and there's certainly, it feels like to us, a runway for this work to be implementable in beef supply chains. We haven't consulted every farmer yet. We've started to. We've talked to farmers, and I think we need to continue to do that and collect their feedback and figure out, does this work? I'll go back to an idea that I've raised at times as this work is developed, which is, the ultimate outcome is kind of a playbook of what works and doesn't work. And what's exciting is this is implementable today. And so we can really speed run that ability to figure out, does this work? Does this not work? Does this work with adjustment? And I think if there's a willingness to go down that path, that will support the industry in being able to accelerate and move in a positive direction.
So you want to wrap? Sure. Give some time back. Okay. Second. Just okay, wrapping up. Give you a little bit of time back. Again, thank you all for your participation today, and thank you to Earl from Tapestry, Fernando and WWF, Blake from Global Food Traceability Center, and Joe from Havere for co-hosting today. Again, an Oystein from FAI Farms. Sorry, I'm just looking around the room. Sorry.
Scared of the name.
Yeah, scared of the name. But I wanted to recap here by just summarizing Better Food Future. Again, I'll highlight one of the purposes here is to provide a facility for co-funding these initiatives to, again, de-risk the investments in some of these early stage pilots. In my previous life, when I led digital at Unilever's Chief Sustainability Office, we commonly brought in partners that had similar goals and similar challenges to share solutions and de-risk the investments for us all. And this really feels like a great opportunity to do so here. Deforestation is a well-documented challenge with well-documented policy momentum and well-documented consumer interests as well. So it is a great opportunity for everyone here to take action together and then realize the benefits of event-based traceability on a product level to help your just core business operations and simplify some compliance burdens, drive more greater business intelligence in your supply chains,
but we can't read your minds. So if everyone could please, I just wanted to remind everyone about the survey in the webinar here, to please give us your thoughts. We want to take everybody's perspectives into account and then build a much more inclusive approach to developing the standards so that existing systems, existing workflows, existing work that's been done is all considered and accounted for as we proceed. As Joe mentioned, we do have some exciting events coming up on the calendar. And just to be clear, we are treating these upcoming events as stock takes on progress. It's not to just have some self-congratulatory fancy events that we're all attending to. While it's a lot of fun, we're really focused on making tangible progress here and delivering measurable impact. So yeah, thank you all, and look forward to partnership with everybody here. Thank you all for your questions, and we will be sharing the recording in the coming days. Thank you all.
Mark, just give me 1 second.
Please.
I pasted the wrong link, but I'm pasting once again the link here for this survey, and in the chat if anybody wants to complete it, so you can click on it, so you have we'll keep you updated about the next steps.
Thank you, Fernando. I'll keep the webinar open for another few minutes so everyone can get that link and give us your thoughts. So thank you all. Really appreciate it. Thanks,
Thank you
Fernando.
all. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.